This painting by the American artist Edward Hopper, Nighthawks, is one of the most famous images in 20th century art. It's been on birthday cards, t-shirts, coffee mugs, and become one of the biggest selling posters of all time. It hangs on the walls of living rooms and bedrooms all over the world. But what is it about this picture that makes it so compelling, so memorable? On the surface, it's just a few figures in a diner, killing time. The rest is speculation. And yet, for over 60 years, it's haunted the imaginations of millions of people, and every one of us has a different interpretation. And that, of course, was just what Hopper wanted. He himself could easily have been a character in this painting. He was silent, elusive. He hated giving interviews or being photographed. He seemed to want to prevent anyone getting close to him, except for one person, his wife Jo, with whom he spent most of his life in an intense, often difficult relationship. Tonight, Imagine enters the world of the mysterious Mr. Hopper. However beguiling and mysterious Hopper's paintings may seem, they're absolutely rooted in everyday life. He paints the world around him, urban America in a particular frame of mind. The city, late at night, no one around, nothing really happening. And yet these are pictures we keep on coming back to. Hopper draws the viewer in by turning the ordinary into something extraordinary.
I think he's capturing small moments, the moments that really reveal what life is. Getting up in the morning and sitting on the edge of the bed and enjoying the sunlight coming through the window. Or sitting alone in a coffee shop and reading the newspaper at night. You know, they're archetypic moments that I think we all have.
What I liked about Hopper when I first saw him was what I liked about the United States when I first came here. These mysterious empty roads and suddenly a filling station with 4 gas pumps and a figure lounging in a state of reverie until one asked him to fill the car. Or those brilliantly lit clapboard houses standing on the seaside in Maine. I think that Hopper is absolutely, singularly, an American sensibility.
Hopper is rooted in the American landscape, but it's ironic that the man most famous for urban scenes of the 20th century city was in fact born into a Victorian world in 1882. A suburban boy with a solid traditional background. We see in Hopper a Victorian really in terms of where his sort of mind was at, and we see a Puritan perhaps.
Well, Hopper was raised in a small town as a Baptist, and in those days, in the 19th century, a pretty strict Baptist upbringing probably meant no alcohol and no dancing. And Hopper's home life was pretty much dominated by a very gregarious mother, very talkative, people liked her, and Hopper was quite close to her. And his father, who was very much more aloof and shy and intellectual, I think Hopper took much more after his father, which meant he had much more trouble relating to people.
In 1906, Hopper did something extraordinary for a small-town American. He swapped suburbia for Bohemia.
he escaped to Paris and stayed there for almost a year. Paris was the most exciting city in the world at that time, and Hopper was swept up by its atmosphere, tasting and experiencing the new century, its radical poets, artists and writers. He identified with this strange, sophisticated world and later drew a caricature of himself as an egg-headed child clutching books by Freud and Jung. In another, he's surrounded by his favorite writers, Ibsen, Verlaine and Proust. These are some of the paintings he produced in his Paris years. He was training his eye, influenced inevitably by the Impressionists and Pointillism. This period was critical to the development of his art, and already we can see things that would preoccupy him. Architectural details, steps, staircases, and of course, overwhelmingly, the light. And Hopper stopped being a mama's boy. In fact, he taunted his mother in his letters home, signing them off, "Your male child." "I haven't any time to waste on disagreeable old ladies," he wrote, "and remember me to your husband." But what he didn't tell his family about was his fascination with Parisian lowlife. He would sit in cafes on street corners and watch with a voyeur's eye the streetwalkers and their clients pass by. This canvas, the largest he'd yet attempted, was Hopper's response to his European trips, and it was painted after he returned to America in 1914. He called it Soir Bleu, after a line by the notorious French poet Arthur Rimbaud. And it represents everything that fascinated Hopper about the seamier side of Bohemian Paris. It's a familiar cast: the pimp, the prostitute, and right at the heart of the picture, the off-duty clown. It also tells us what he's been learning from European painting. The colour and composition are far closer to Manet and Picasso than to any American artist. But sadly, to Hopper's dismay, the picture for which he'd had so much ambition was savaged by the American critics, who denounced its foreignness, its Frenchness, and its decadence. They were utterly unforgiving.
It's a wonderful picture, but it had totally fallen into obscurity, and Hopper himself had basically given up on it. And that's why I think he took a different tack. He started to paint what was around him in America and not reminiscences of Paris. There was just too much negative response to that painting.
Hopper last went abroad in 1910. He'd never leave America again for the rest of his life. But he was keeping up the inspiration he'd found in Europe while making a name for himself in the parochial American art scene, small scale and trapped in the 19th century.
Experience of most Americans who have been to Europe for the first time, that America seems very crude and raw and unsympathetic to art, and it still is to some extent.
Hopper picked up on something said by his teacher, Robert Henry. Go to the life about you for your subject matter. What he saw around him was the new landscape of America. Man-made, industrial, the harsh lines and shapes of the built-up city. He wouldn't abandon American painting's realist tradition, but drag it into the modern world and strip out the sentimentality. He was an artist who believed in being brutal and honest. His intention was to depict what he called all the sweltering, tawdry life of the American small town, and behind it, all the sad desolation of our suburban landscape.
If you ride a train in America, if you take a train anywhere, you go through places that are just so ugly you can't stand it. And just everyday life in America tends to be you have to accept so much ugliness for these tiny bonbons of picturesqueness. It gets you down. I think that Hopper was one of the only artists that found beauty in that disappointment. And he makes it really clear sometimes of just the Victorian house and the railroad tracks, or these views of broken down industrial towns and that kind of thing.
At that particular time, the majority of people, even if they were living in small towns, they were in the industrial landscape. And I think that industrial landscape produced a particular kind of loneliness and isolation. And I think he was the first painter to capture that, the essence of those souls that were alone.
But the American art world didn't like Hopper's American pictures any more than his French ones. Offensively hard, one critic wrote. He had exhibitions, but sold virtually nothing. So to make ends meet, he did something he absolutely detested: commercial illustration. To him it was slavery, drudgery. But he was learning something vital to his painting: how to tell a story with the simplest means. And then in 1923, his new girlfriend, the artist Jo Neveson, set him up for what became his big break.
The Brooklyn Museum invited Jo Neveson to show her watercolors in a major survey. They did not think of inviting Edward Hopper. It was Jo who said to the organizers, "But what about Edward Hopper? He does watercolors too." And they put up 6 of his next to 6 of hers, and the rest is history because he won the purchase prize. Brooklyn Museum bought Mansard Roof. I think they paid $100. His career took off. The critics really wrote about him as a painter for the first time.
Hopper was by now 41 years old. With his confidence boosted by his first museum sale and the promise of a big gallery show the following year, he could finally give up the day job. In 1924, he and Jo married, and she moved into his studio. For the rest of their lives, they would climb up the 74 steps it took to get there, hauling up coal for the heating, nesting away from the world outside. This small spare space in Washington Square was Hopper's home for 54 years. There were only 2 rooms. This was the studio, no kitchen to speak of, and a bathroom shared with the other tenants. He also lived here with his wife, Jo. That was her studio over there, and this was the place that he worked. Annex on the corner, a little bedroom where he died. This was not just the place where he lived and worked. It really was his spiritual home. He loved the light flooding in from Washington Square. Most of Hopper's greatest works were painted in this room. He liked to immerse himself in his painting, working silently in the perfect light for hours on end. Jo beavered away in the darker room at the back. He'd even drawn a line between their spaces and banned her from crossing it while he worked. She was a distraction to him, but amazingly, they were barely ever apart for the next 43 years.
I wanted to interview Hopper, whom I admired enormously, and so I called up, and this woman answered, and I said who I was, and I said I would like to bring him to Boston and interview him, and she said, yes. I said, well, would you like to check with him? She said, no. That was Mrs. Hopper. So they came, and we had a very pleasant time. She was clearly so much a part of him that she could not be separated except by surgery. And so what we planned to do was give 20 minutes to Hopper and then bring on the little tempest that Mrs. Hopper was.
The Hoppers are really inseparable, and I think that we should ask Mrs. Hopper remedy that and ask her to join us. What you're looking at now is a picture that Mr. Hopper painted of Mrs. Hopper many years ago. Mrs. Hopper, how do you feel about that picture? Because what I'm going to say is this, that Mr. Hopper is supposed to play down things in his pictures, play down the emotion. Do you feel that that's an affectionate picture, that one he painted of you?
Yes, when I recall things that he has done of people with double chins and grabs right onto things they wouldn't like at all. He didn't do that this time to me.
Yes, I think it's...
He was like granite. He was like a rock. He had enormous gravitas. And as Brian said, he'd say something and then 6 months later you'd get the rest of the sentence if you were lucky, that kind of thing. And she was jabbering all the time. She used to have me on the phone for hours talking about women. We women together, she said. I don't know whether he was unable to express himself in words. I think he just didn't feel like it, really. I think he just didn't feel a need to be verbal. He was an interior person.
Since they spent so much time alone together, it was very frustrating. She wanted to have an engaging conversationalist, and he wasn't able to be that. I would call him a Victorian man living in the modern age. He was born, after all, in 1882, and his wife was only born a year later, and yet she became one of the new women in Greenwich Village, and he remained the Victorian lad, and just couldn't adapt to the changing roles of women.
The Hoppers led a simple life. It was routine and somewhat claustrophobic. They painted, read, and hardly ever entertained. When they did go out, they usually went out together, just the two of them. They'd have something to eat at a diner, then go on to the theatre, or more likely, the cinema. But even in his leisure time, Edward Hopper could never switch off from painting, and his favourite kind of entertainment had a profound influence on his work. In trying to describe a Hopper painting, you naturally resort to the language of cinema. Framing, lighting, narrative, mood. So much of the action or inaction in his pictures seems to be staged, and Hopper is both the director and creator of the mise-en-scène. Sometimes he would sit in a cinema all day long. He was steeped in the movies. It was one of the few developments of the modern world that he felt he could wholeheartedly embrace.
What do you want?
Do you always get home this late?
A lot of the time, Hopper is creating a frame, the frame of the Super 35, within the canvas. I mean, if you look again and again, he will, particularly with the interiors, he'll put a frame of a window, the dark foreground, and often kind of obliterate the sense of there being any glass there. It's almost as if the side of the house has been ripped away and you're just looking straight in. So it's like a kind of X-ray of a house. The most famous ones, Nighthawks, there is a movie screen there. It's a lit movie screen, a lit box within a dark environment. And so I think that a lot of the time it is the case that, he's actually kind of creating, without you knowing it, an image that seems to be projected on a screen.
2,000 wasn't enough.
Armitage is in the mood for music.
I was very taken by some of the typical aspects of film noir. The slash of oblique light and shadow, like a guillotine's edge. Again and again you find that in Hopper. You find those parallelograms and rhomboids of great streams of light tracking towards a wall and vibrating on the wall. Vibrating in a way, by the way, that's beautifully painted. Sometimes the light is very complex, as in that hotel foyer where the woman is reading on the right, there's a gentleman standing on the left with his coat over his arm. Mm-hmm. There are several light sources in that, and the light is converging and dipping and dancing around in the most ecstatic way.
Sometimes when the viewpoint, as in several Hopper pictures, is from a high vantage point, looking down at an illuminated window on the opposite side of the street, you are left with the almost irresistible impression that it is not simply the artist's viewpoint, that there is a sort of voyeuristic sense of an undisclosed eye which is looking at what is represented.
A lifetime of movie-going certainly influenced how Hopper made his paintings. But Hopper, in return, more than any other artist, influenced the cinema itself. Hitchcock's Psycho, with its famous brooding house, is a direct parallel to Hopper's picture House by the Railroad, painted over 30 years earlier.
10 to Van Horn, 90.
And the atmospheres of Wim Wenders' film, Paris, Texas, were inspired by his obsession with Hopper's work.
We've all, myself more than most, borrowed shamelessly from him, you know, and specific canvases often. It's very difficult when you see these things, you know, live, as it were, to forget them. You know, they're very, very powerful atmospheres, and they invade your subconscious. In fact, there's a direct steal. The first shot of American Beauty, there's two shots in there of Kevin Spacey trapped behind a kind of bay window, which really is a quote from Cape Cod Morning. There's a woman in a bay window staring out at a beautiful day, and she seems to think that she is in control of the day, or rather she's welcoming the day as hers. But where Hopper puts us, she seems to be a prisoner. She seems to be unaware of the fact she's captive, and that nature is elsewhere and that light is elsewhere.
There is a picture, a tiny oil painting on cardboard, that Hopper made as a student, and which he called Solitary Figure in a Theatre. He was only 20 years old at the time, but it eerily captures his obsessive nature and that stillness and sense of anticipation, waiting for the scene to unfold, which hangs over so much of his work.
We're partners. 50-50. As long as I get my half, I'm on your side.
See what you mean.
That stillness affects the way Hopper directs his characters. They seem almost like stand-ins before the real drama begins. There's little activity anywhere. His cast is posed, frozen. The faces usually expressionless and crudely painted. They don't ever get the chance to do very much. It's as if he's forgotten to say, action. How much feeling do you think Hopper actually invests in these characters, in these figures?
Alan, there is a school of thought that feels these figures, these people are not very interesting. I think that's not so at all. I think these people have one characteristic in common. They're waiting. And if they're not waiting, they're reading. So they are involved in this interior discourse with themselves, which is not loneliness, or they are simply in transit somewhere. They're either in railway carriages, or they're in trains, or going somewhere. So these characters of his, far from being unimportant, it seems to me, have a very common and determining profile. That is, they are in reverie and they are waiting, and they add to that echo of that space, which is also suspenseful and about to become something.
The characters seem unaware of the tension. I think that's what's very interesting, and the tension is imposed by the composition, so that the character will seem to be lost in a dream world. For example, the one with the woman sitting alone at night with the reflected lights behind her. Those lights, which initially you think, oh gosh, how beautiful, how pretty, those lights bear down on her. They push the tension of the frame downwards onto her. So she seems to be trapped. She seems to be unaware that she's locked up in a cell.
There is a curious atmosphere of melancholy and solitude about the works. A curious sort of sunlit, empty, mysterious melancholy. The melancholy of arrival, perhaps. We all have experienced this, that we arrive in a hotel at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, unpack, and then you wonder, am I going to go out? Am I going to go down to the diner and get myself a drink? And why am I sitting on the edge of the bed, staring sightlessly at the red brick buildings on the opposite side of the street? Is anything worth doing next? And I think what he captures is what is in all our lives, these moments when you wonder what on earth is going to happen next, not because something will disclose itself or something dramatic will happen next, but because something must happen, otherwise life will seemingly come to a sunlit standstill.
His solitary, brooding pictures have led to speculation that Hopper suffered from depression. But because he was so private and reclusive, there's little real evidence to support this. But we can say for sure that he was introspective, grumpy, misanthropic even.
Once I found 63 volumes of diaries that his wife kept, I knew a lot more about him. And while some people have said, you know, that I brought out that his wife didn't think that he was very nice to her, and I have to say that it sounds like she was right, since he tried to get her to stop being an artist. He didn't think she was a very good painter, and to be truthful, she was not nearly as good a painter as he was. I would be the first to admit that, but she was a lot better painter than many of the men he supported and felt were fine. He just didn't think his wife should be a painter. It was an embarrassment to him.
The Hoppers' relationship was tempestuous. Diary entries quoted in Levin's biography describe fights, Hopper dragging Joe across the studio, she biting right into his hands to make him stop. No matter how loyal she was, he could totally exasperate her.
She was really somebody who felt very bitter about giving up her own career for his, at the same time that she was so supportive of him.
She would call you up all the time, wouldn't she?
Endlessly, yeah. That was tough when she'd get on the phone when I was trying to prepare a lecture or something for the next day, and it would go on for hours about women and how abused women were. So this was really something that she thought about a lot, but she was not, from what I could see, an abused woman on any level at all.
But you know, men are not grateful creatures.
You think not?
No, I don't think so.
Why do you say
It's
that?
women that are grateful.
Really?
And who
I think
cares? And who wants it? Who cares about it?
Oh, I think you're a little hard on us, aren't you?
Well...
He was a gentle and kindly man, and she was, it's hard to speak of friends negatively, and I'm not going to speak of her negatively, but she was, shall we say, a little impulsive, did not have a sense of humor. He had a wonderful, gentle sense of ironic humor. That went by her, just didn't even notice. So, being, as Barbara says, very fond of her, I don't want to, be negative about her. But there are times, I am quite sure, he must have been tempted to kill her. And I'm surprised at times watching them that he didn't.
Tell me a bit about the caricatures, the playful, ironic humor that he has.
This is his, they would have had an argument. And if you've been in the studio, you know that the bathroom is down the hall. So she would go down the hall to the bathroom, and he would sketch one of these and leave it on the table. And she would come in, and then, of course, she would be furious. Here is my favorite. All their life, she argued with him about getting her into a show. She was always rejected. He was a judge of the show. Why, if you were the judge of a show, can't I get a picture in? And he would merely say, because they don't like your work. So he puts her pictures of cats up on the wall and puts a mouse in front and calls it Mrs. Kit Hopper's one-man jury. And this is his humor coming out and trying to be light about the fact that her work was not like his.
One of them has to do with the fact that she's reading a book when he's hungry and he's famished and he's looking very starved. And again, as it turned out, she wouldn't cook. She thought that was a woman's waste of time. You know, you weren't supposed to have to feed the man. She loved to read, so that was clear. She had her nose in a book.
So there were really modes of talking about their marriage, it seems to me. And he showed enormous tolerance and wit.
Hopper's tolerance, though, was often stretched by life in the city, where he could never really enjoy the emptiness and quiet that he craved. The answer lay north of New York, in a landscape that captivated both him and Joe, and which they returned to again and again.
Hopper chose to come here to Cape Cod, about 300 miles from New York, in order to escape the bits of city life he didn't like. He deliberately sought out the isolation, but it was the special quality of Cape life that really attracted him. He started coming here in the early 1920s with Joe. He learned to drive specially. His first car was a 1925 Dodge. The car represented his freedom to roam and to paint, and it rapidly became a mobile studio for both of them. But the car, like the house, was his domain, and it was Hopper who decided on the demarcation lines between his space and hers. So naturally enough, he chose to lounge on the back seat, painting in great comfort, while Joe was obliged to perch precariously, hunched up by the steering wheel in the front of the car.
This picture of Joe is typical of the watercolours Hopper painted in Cape Cod. Loosely and quickly done on the spot, a far cry from his labour-intensive studio work. But his imagery here was consistent with his cityscapes. Back streets, wide, empty scenes, and always with that pervasive sense of the Cape Cod sunlight hitting the buildings and illuminating the landscape.
I think he was absolutely attracted to the light of Cape Cod. It must have been a kind of spiritual thing for him. I think it was definitely a contrast to his sort of urban alienation. The lighthouse certainly represented a psychologically charged thing for him. Railroad tracks, sunsets, things like that all had a meaning that wasn't abstract.
I like the long shadows of early and late sunlight. I'm very much interested in light, and particularly sunlight, trying to paint sunlight without eliminating the form under it. If I can, I would like to do sunlight that was just sunlight in itself, perhaps. But it has to be, sunlight has to be on some natural form.
But it was more than simply the light that attracted Hopper to Truro, the town where they spent most of their time. He loved its closeness to the sea and its patches of barely populated land. And so in 1933, the year he had his first major retrospective at New York's Museum of Modern Art, he and Joe decided to build a permanent home in Truro, on a spot that would make it almost impossible for him to be disturbed.
You wouldn't believe how long it's taken us to find this place. But there it is. The house that Joe built. And look, that's the garage that they must have kept the 1925 Dodge in.
This was a retreat in every sense. Joe bought the land on both sides of their plot to make sure there'd be no neighbours. The house was essentially one big studio for him, with a bedroom where she'd be dispatched if she felt the urge to paint. Everything about it was designed to serve his work. Hopper's treatment of Jo has always raised questions about his attitude to women. Was he controlling of her, or was she integral to his art?
Most of the women, regardless of how they were portrayed, of course, as you know, were Jo, because she didn't like any other women to pose for him.
Is that why you think she ended up being the person who posed for him? Because
she made it quite clear, didn't she?
Oh, she insisted.
Jo, she insisted.
And I remember before he died, Barbara, he had to sign every nude drawing, and he was kind enough to give us a couple. He had to sign them to my wife, Jo.
Yeah.
To my wife, Jo.
Yeah.
To my wife, Jo. So that they had to be sanitized for public gaze.
I don't think she ever let him use nude models. I don't think
She was the nude model. Hopper is a great painter of women alone. He doesn't paint nudes, he paints naked women. And they're a little shocking in that sense. They're alone in their nakedness.
He's a man who looks at women so intently that it appears cruel. You know, even what he does to their bodies, like there's this one of a nude woman standing in sunlight in a room. She's got these insanely muscular legs, and the breasts are kind of out of perspective. It's so jarring and so unfriendly to the idea of luxuriating with a naked lady that I don't know whether that's a kind of perverse aesthetic or a perverse attitude toward women, or both. I guess he likes the vulnerability of the image of a woman in a painting, and how startling it is to violate that.
It's tempting to see this painting, Excursion into Philosophy, as a parable of the Hopper's marriage. Jo was rather scandalized by it. A letter to a friend recalls the following conversation. She told Ed, "A nice girl wouldn't get the soles of her feet so grimy." Hopper replied, "I'm not sure she is a nice girl. She wears 4-inch spikes." What about the sexual content, erotic content in these pictures? Is that all in the eyes of the beholder, or is there that sense of eroticism, fantasy?
The person posing naked always was his wife. So if you're going to think about the sexual content or implications of them, or even fantasies of them, it was still his wife, the woman he was closest to, his lover, presumably, that he was painting. And I don't know how you deal with that.
But he eroticized her, often into a floozy.
Yes, he did. He did, which was not part of his puritanical bent on some levels, if you're going
Not at all. And then he did the stripper. That picture seems quite a shock in his oeuvre, doesn't it?
That's a shock.
And that was her originally, and then he
made her
garish. He tackled directly male desire and lust.
He really had this duality about women and the power of women's sexuality. And there's this incredible Victorian repression and yet titillation throughout his paintings. That's what's going on. This man, mired in Victorian times, titillated by the modern world, but unable to embrace it.
By the 1950s, American art was internationally recognized. A whole new generation, the abstract expressionists, had broken through. Their paintings were complex and all about harnessing the raw energy of American life. Hopper's stillness made him seem a man out of time. By then, Hopper was already in his 60s. His fame had come relatively late in life. He called the new abstract art gobbledygook. It didn't touch on the direct representation of humankind he thought crucial. But sticking with realism brought him problems. He was constantly anxious about having anything left to say. His art became ever more scrupulous and refined. It all boiled down to very precise moments, gestures and sensations. He found it agonizing coming up with the right scenario or composition, and would complete only 2 or 3 canvases a year. In this museum basement, I had a rare chance to see the lengths Hopper would go to get his paintings right. So was he very methodical, very meticulous about these early drawings, Russell?
Well, I think, if these are any indication, I would say certainly, because there are so many sketches for the same painting.
So real particular attention paid to the gestures, to the hand gestures. These drawings are fascinating because they show the absolute rigor Hopper put into his paintings. The way that clasped hands or the tension in the grip of a cigarette might add to the overall mood of his picture. And the obsessive way he would go out and record architectural details. He says that table is to be mahogany, and the colours pale yellow, red seat, silver base to the table.
Reflections in tabletop, ceiling white. Light
on top of door. But the biggest revelation of all in these sketches is the way Hopper places the figures. But he once considered putting them at the same table, then gradually moved them further and further apart. And here in the final drawing, he puts a great distance between the two characters, and that's what gives the painting its tension.
I've always been very interested in how to tell a story by where you place people relative to each other without words, the distance you put between people. And he's very, very specific, and these paintings are very, very carefully thought out, and the eye lines are very specific, such and such as looking at that person or looking into the middle distance. If you look at it, you realize how careful that is.
Right up to the end of his career, Hopper refused to be pinned down on his work's content. He said it was all in the mind of the viewer, and the pictures are magnetic. They pull you in, tease you to supply some meaning, some narrative, but they offer very few clues. And that's why, decades after Hopper finished his paintings, people are still debating what's really going on in them.
One of the reasons everybody finds it so hard to characterize them is precisely because they are mysterious still. They are about a state of being somehow that is very human, and that maybe people sense in them more than they can't even articulate it, and so then they make up all kinds of stories.
I think if you're human and you have an imagination and you have the capacity to dream stories for other humans around you, then you're naturally going to see a painting and you're going to maybe not sit there and make up the story that goes with it, but you're going to feel the force of the narrative because you're a human and you're witnessing and you're seeing other people in situations.
The whole idea of human experience is something that he kept constantly probing. There was an enormous curiosity to understand, and I think to some extent that's what these paintings are about.
Hopper's paintings reflect his deep interest in philosophy and his inquiry into the human condition. But it's an inquiry about himself too. This painting, Rooms by the Sea, is a beautiful depiction of the view from his Cape Cod studio. But it's also seen as alluding to escape, even suicide. Perhaps that's why Hopper rejected the original title, Jumping Off Place. But maybe it was more an attempt to keep his own self hidden. His recurring themes, silence, the solitary figure, the sea, the power of light, all of these were aspects of his own being he could only ever express through painting.
as he said to me when he painted Sun in an Empty Room, one of his last paintings, and I said, "What are you after in it?" And he said, "I'm after me. I'm after me." Again and again, it's me. I want to know who I am. How do I define myself? So the issue of self, that strange artificial construct that is a convention that we accept about each other, that was something that he pursued and was reflected in the solitude of his paintings. He was finding out about himself with each painting he painted. I remember sitting with him at the retrospective at the Whitney, and he was sitting there with his hat and his stick between his legs. I had the sense, as I watched the pictures, looking at him and their coordinates crossing, as it were, in his person, I had a sense that he was looking at himself, that this was a vast self-portrait, a vast exploration of what he called a vast and varied realm of the interior.
Sun in an Empty Room was one of Hopper's very last pictures. He'd finally achieved his ambition to paint just light. It was finished in 1963 when he was 81 and already in poor health. He died peacefully at home in his studio 4 years later with Jo by his side. She wrote of it, "No pain, no sound, and eyes serene and even happy, and very beautiful in death, like an El Greco."
I know that she was very, very shocked and sad to be without him. Despite the problems of their relationship, they were extraordinarily close.
You could say in a sort of old-fashioned way, she was his muse, really, wasn't she?
Absolutely. I think she was essential to his production and to his life, and I think he was absolutely the center of her life, no matter how much she resented him in terms of his attitude toward her art.
And this is the last picture Edward Hopper ever painted. It's an obvious farewell, and uncharacteristically there appears to be no doubt as to the subject or who the figures represent.
I love that painting. I find it corny and wonderful and honest and sentimental, and, but you know, I think the strength of the painting is the relationship of their size to the size of the canvas, to the size of the stage. That gives it that frisson of recognition that there's some truth to it, you know, certainly from the artist's point of view. You've sort of devoted your entire life to a kind of entertainment, to an audience that's anonymous, that's, you know, not there. You know, you've spent most of it in the sort of the kind of psychic costume of a clown. I mean, you know, it's touching.
Hopper's metaphoric clown forms a perfect bookend to his long career. The decades of creativity that first saw light in the disowned Soir Bleu from his Paris years, with its desolate clown. In many ways, these two paintings, over 50 years apart, sum up Hopper's unchanging nature. The man who didn't quite fit into any box, frequently at odds with himself and with the world around him. But by being a bit apart, by seeing the world in terms of isolated human events and experiences, Hopper managed, magically, to leave us with something timeless. These are paintings as emblematic of our own period as the years in which they were made. Their very lack of specific incident or detailed narrative is in fact what keeps them resonating. And in trying to sum up their ongoing, vast and universal appeal, it might be apt to quote Hopper himself. If you could say it in words, there'd be no reason to paint.
information and images from Tate Modern's Edward Hopper exhibition, go to bbc.co.uk/collective.